My name is Rachel Donovan. I'm 32 years old. And the moment my brother stood up at his own wedding reception and tapped his champagne glass, I felt something in my chest tighten, because I knew that smile. That smile had never once meant anything good for me. He waited until the room was quiet, until every single face was turned toward him, glasses raised, ready to celebrate. Then he said it. "I'd like to thank everyone who actually made something of themselves for being here tonight." He paused, let the laughter ripple. "And I'd like to thank my little sister Rachel for coming too, even though she's still figuring out what she wants to be when she grows up." The room laughed. Not everyone, but enough. My sister-in-law covered her mouth with her hand, though I couldn't tell if she was hiding a smile or a grimace. My mother shook her head like she was embarrassed, but not embarrassed enough to say anything. My father raised his glass along with everyone else. I was 32. I had a master's degree in environmental science. I worked for a nonprofit restoring degraded wetlands along the Gulf Coast, a job that paid modestly and meant everything to me. My brother, who had just married into his wife's family's commercial real estate business, had decided that this moment, in front of 140 guests, was the right time to remind everyone of what he thought I was worth. I set my champagne glass down very carefully on the table. I picked up my clutch. I looked at my mother, who was suddenly very interested in her centerpiece. I looked at my father, who was mid-sip. I stood up, walked to my brother, and said quietly enough that only he could hear, "Enjoy tonight. Because after this, I'm done being your punchline." He laughed. Thought I was being dramatic. He was wrong. Before I tell you what happened 63 days later, when my phone showed 47 missed calls and a voicemail so desperate it made me sit down on my kitchen floor just to finish listening to it. Let me ask you something. What time is it where you are right now? Because I want to know how far this story travels. Drop it in the comments. I didn't cry at the reception. I made it through the valet line, through the 20-minute drive home, through unlocking my apartment door, through feeding my cat. I was almost impressed with myself. Then I sat on the edge of my bathtub, fully dressed, and cried until my chest hurt, not because of what my brother had said, but because of how automatically everyone had laughed. That was the part that stayed with me. Not one person at that table had looked uncomfortable. Not one person had set their glass down, or cleared their throat, or caught my eye. They had all just laughed, the way people laugh at a joke so familiar, they don't even need to find it funny anymore. My humiliation had become background music at family events. It had been playing so long, nobody heard it as cruel. My phone buzzed within the hour. My mother first. "Rachel, honey, you know how your brother gets when he's nervous. He didn't mean anything by it. Please don't make this into a thing." My brother texted 20 minutes later. "You seriously left?" It was a joke. Everyone thought it was funny. His new wife sent a carefully worded message that said she hoped I was okay and that weddings were emotionally overwhelming for everyone. I respected the effort even if it landed wrong. My father called twice. I let both go to voicemail. His first message was 4 seconds long, just him sighing and hanging up. His second was longer. "We'll talk at Sunday dinner. Don't blow this out of proportion." I turned my phone face down, fed my cat a second time by accident because I forgot I'd already done it, and went to bed at 8:30. The next morning I drove 2 hours down to Barataria Bay and spent the day with my field team pulling invasive phragmites from a marsh restoration site. The work was physical and quiet and smelled like salt and mud and something alive trying to come back. That was what I did. I helped dying ecosystems recover. I documented what had been damaged, and I built the conditions for something healthier to take root. I was good at it. I had 3 peer-reviewed publications, a regional conservation award I'd never mentioned at a single family dinner, and a grant proposal under review that could fund the next 4 years of our program. To my family, I was the sister who hadn't bought a house yet. Sunday dinner came. I didn't go. First time in 6 years I'd skipped it voluntarily. The messages shifted tone by Monday. My brother went from casual to irritated. "Mom's upset you didn't come. You're making this worse than it is." My mother sent 3 texts and a voice note I couldn't bring myself to open until Tuesday. My father said nothing, which from him was its own kind of statement. By Wednesday, a different kind of quiet had settled in, the kind that happens when a family realizes their usual tools aren't working. I wasn't answering. I wasn't absorbing. I wasn't smoothing things over on their behalf the way I had been trained to do my entire life. What they didn't know was that the silence on my end wasn't emptiness. It was the first time in 32 years I'd given myself permission to be angry without apologizing for it. I spent that week working late. I finalized the grant proposal and sent it off. I called my best friend, Denise, a high school biology teacher, and the only person outside my work life who had always treated my career like it mattered, and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "The fact that he did that at his own wedding tells you everything about how safe he has always felt doing it. He's never had a reason to stop." That landed somewhere deep. I started writing that Thursday. Nothing formal, just a document on my laptop. I wrote about what it felt like to be the sibling in a family who is designated as the cautionary tale. Not the black sheep exactly, I hadn't done anything wrong. More like the measuring stick, the one everyone else pointed to when they needed to feel further ahead. You don't have to be a failure for a family to need you to be one. You just have to be different enough that your choices make theirs feel safer, by comparison. I wrote about how that dynamic doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. It's the birthday dinner where your job gets a raised eyebrow while your brother's new client gets a toast. It's your mother forwarding you job listings at companies with better stability when you're doing work that genuinely matters. It's your father's silence when your brother crosses a line, because correcting him would require acknowledging the line exists. I didn't publish it anywhere. Not yet. I just wrote until the feeling had somewhere to go besides inward. 4 weeks after the wedding, I got a phone call I wasn't expecting. The firm was called Hartwell & Associates, and they handled estate and trust administration in Baton Rouge. The attorney who called me introduced herself as Sylvia Crane, and she got straight to the point the way people do when they've made a lot of calls like this one. "Your grandmother, Lorraine Donovan, passed away last Tuesday. I'm sorry for your loss. I'm calling because her estate named you specifically in a matter that requires your direct involvement. We'd like to schedule a meeting at your earliest convenience in person, if possible." I sat down in my desk chair very slowly. My grandmother had lived in Baton Rouge her whole life. She had built a small empire of practical things, a storage facility she'd owned for 30 years, a commercial property on a street that had become considerably more valuable as the city grew around it, and savings managed so quietly that even our family had no clear sense of what they added up to. She was not flashy. She kept her business to herself. She had outlived one husband, endured a second, and raised my father with a consistency that bordered on stubbornness. She had also been the only person in my family who asked follow-up questions when I talked about my work. The only one who remembered the names of the ecosystems I studied. She used to say that the most important things in the world were the ones people walked past without noticing, and that if I'd decided to spend my life paying attention to them, then I was doing something that mattered. She passed away on a Tuesday, and I found out from a lawyer on a Wednesday, and nobody in my family had called to tell me. That part took a while to land. I called Denise that night. She said, "Rachel, they knew, and they didn't call you." She said it quietly, like she was handing me something fragile. What does that tell you? I drove to Baton Rouge that weekend for the meeting. I didn't tell my family I was going. The law office was on a quiet street, second floor, waiting room with a potted fern and a bowl of wrapped butterscotch candies nobody touched. Sylvia Crane was in her 50s, efficient, and clearly experienced at managing the moment when a family discovers that inheritance is not distributed the way they assumed. My brother was already there when I walked in. So was his new wife. So were my parents. My mother's face did something complicated when she saw me, relief and resentment folded together. My brother went very still. He hadn't known I was coming, which meant he'd assumed, for whatever reason, that I wouldn't be there. That told me something. Sylvia opened with the estate overview. My grandmother's assets were more substantial than anyone had said out loud, though from the way my brother exhaled slowly through his nose, I suspected he'd had a private number in mind. The commercial property on Riverside had been placed in a trust before her death. The trust named a sole managing trustee with full discretionary authority over income distributions and any decisions about sale or development. That trustee was me. My brother laughed. One sharp sound, exactly the way he had laughed at his wedding when he thought I was being dramatic. My sister-in-law put her hand on his arm. My mother's face went white. My father closed his eyes for a moment that lasted just a little too long. Sylvia continued. The property generated rental income from 2 long-term commercial tenants. It had been appraised recently. The number she cited made my brother's hand tighten on the armrest. There was also a reserve account attached to the trust. My grandmother had been specific in her instructions. Distributions from the account were entirely at my discretion, and my discretion alone. My father said carefully, "There must be a provision for the family." "Surely. There are provisions for Lorraine's charitable wishes," Sylvia said. "Beyond that, the discretionary authority rests with Rachel." My brother turned to me. I had seen that expression before at the wedding, just before he tapped his glass. Recalculating, rearranging his face for a different kind of conversation. "Rachel," he said, in a tone he had never once used with me. "Obviously, we should all sit down together and figure out what makes sense for the family." For the family. There it was. I asked Sylvia if we could have a few minutes and stepped into the hallway alone. I stood next to the potted fern and thought about what my grandmother used to say about attention, about paying it to the things people walked past. I thought about how she had watched, for 32 years, the way this family assigned value and had decided, quietly and legally and without any drama, to say something about it. I took the sealed letter Sylvia had handed me and held it for a moment before opening it. My grandmother's handwriting was small and even, the kind that comes from someone who never wasted space. She wrote that she had loved me since before I could walk, and that watching me become someone with a genuine sense of purpose had been one of the more satisfying things of her life. She wrote that she had noticed the way family dinners worked, even when she said nothing about it. She wrote that she had thought for a long time about what she could do, and that the most honest thing she could offer was this: the chance to make decisions without having to earn the right to make them first. Then she wrote the line that made me press my back against the hallway wall and stay there for a full minute. "You have always been worth more than the room was willing to admit." I am admitting it now. When I walked back into the conference room, I sat down and I said what I needed to say plainly. "I'm going to take some time to review the trust documents fully before I make any decisions about anything. That's going to take a few weeks." My brother opened his mouth. I kept going. "I also want to say something directly, because I think we've spent a long time not saying things directly." I looked at him. "What you said at your wedding was cruel. You've been doing a version of it my whole life, and this is the first time I'm saying out loud that I'm not going to absorb it anymore. That's not connected to this trust. That's just true." No one said anything. My mother started to speak. I held up one hand, gently. "I'm not doing this here. I'm going to go home. I'll be in touch with Sylvia when I'm ready." The 47 missed calls started before I made it back to my car. I didn't answer any of them that day, or the next. I went back to work. I waded into the marsh. I wrote in my document. I called Denise, who brought takeout to my apartment on a Thursday, and sat across from me on the floor while we ate pad thai, and she said, "Your grandmother was remarkable," and I said, "She really was," and we stayed there in companionable silence for a while. The voicemails were a study in stages. My mother went through worry, then frustration, then something closer to genuine reflection. Over the course of about 11 messages, my father left 3, each shorter and more awkward than the last. My brother's early messages had an edge reasonable sounding on the surface, but with the particular tightness of someone who believes they are owed something and is trying not to say so. His later ones were quieter. His wife left one message. She said she was sorry about the wedding. Just that, no justification, no context. Just sorry. I appreciated that. 3 weeks after the meeting, my brother showed up at my apartment. I saw him through the peephole for a moment before opening the door. He looked like he hadn't slept particularly well. He was holding a paper coffee cup with both hands, like it was something to do with them. I opened the door, but didn't invite him in immediately. "How did you know where I lived?" "Mom," he said. Then, Can I come in? I stepped back. He sat on my couch and looked around my apartment the way people do when they're trying to find something to say. My cat jumped up next to him and he scratched her ears automatically. You have a cat. I have a cat. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I've been thinking about the wedding. Okay. I think I've been. He stopped. Started again. I think I've treated you like a joke for a long time. And I told myself it was just how we were. The way siblings are. But I heard what you said in that conference room, and I've been trying to figure out if I actually believe that's true, or if I just need you to believe it so I can keep doing it. That was the most honest sentence my brother had said to me in a decade. Maybe longer. I sat down in the chair across from him. Which one is it? He looked at his coffee cup. I think I've always known you were smarter than me. Not about business or money. Just about what matters. And that bothered me more than I let myself admit. He looked up. That's not your fault. I know it's not your fault. I believed him. Not completely. Not the way I might have believed him when I was 22, and still needed him to be a certain way. But enough. Enough to stay in the conversation. I'm not going to use the trust to rescue anyone's business, I said. That's not what it's for, and it's not what she intended. He nodded, like he'd known this was coming. I know. And the next time you introduce me to someone, you tell them what I actually do. Accurately. Without the footnote. He was quiet, then. Yeah. Okay. We didn't hug. We weren't there yet. He finished his coffee and left, and I stood at my window after the door closed and looked at my street, the neighbor's orange tree, 2 kids on bikes, a delivery truck blocking the corner, and I felt something I couldn't immediately name. It took me until later that evening to identify it. It was the particular relief of a conversation that had finally managed to be about the real thing. The family gathering happened 6 weeks after the trust meeting. I agreed to it because I had terms now, and they had agreed to them my mother in a long, careful email that was clearly several drafts old, my father on the phone, my brother in person. The terms were simple. No jokes at my expense, no diminishing my work, no treating my choices as the punchline that made everyone else's choices look better. If it happened, I would leave without argument, and the conversation about the trust would become considerably shorter. They were all there when I arrived. My sister-in-law had brought flowers, which was either genuine or strategic, and I decided to let it be genuine. My mother had made the lemon cake she made for actual celebrations, which felt like its own kind of statement. We sat around the table. For a while, it was careful. People spoke in the slightly elevated register that comes from being aware of themselves. My father asked about my grant proposal. I told him we'd heard back approved. Full funding. 4 years. My mother said, "Rachel, that's wonderful," and she meant it. I could tell. It was the first time that sentence had come out of her without a qualifier chasing it. My brother said, "Tell me more about what you actually do down there. Like specifically." So I told them. I explained the marsh system. I explained what Phragmites does to native habitat, and why it matters and how slow the recovery is, and why slowness isn't failure. I talked about the data, and the publications and the grant. I talked about why this work, specifically this work, was the thing that made me feel most like myself. No one checked their phone. No one changed the subject. My father asked a follow-up question. A real one. It lasted maybe 20 minutes. It felt like something that should have happened years ago. The drive home was quiet, in a way that felt different from before. Not the quiet of swallowing something, just quiet. I finished the piece I'd been writing that night. Not the angry draft. That one stayed private. A different version, cleaner, about what it costs a person to spend years being the cautionary tale in someone else's story, and what it takes to stop volunteering for the role. I published it under my own name. By the following morning, it had been shared 400 times. A woman in Minnesota wrote that she'd read it 3 times and sent it to her daughter. A man in his 60s said he recognized his family in every paragraph. Someone in the comments wrote, simply, "I didn't know other people's families did this too. That was why I wrote it." Not for reach, not for any of what came after. Just because the truth, when it's specific enough, has a way of finding the people who needed it to exist. I called Sylvia Crane that week, and we spent 2 hours going through the trust structure. I had already decided what I wanted to do with the property income. A portion would go toward an endowment at the State University's Environmental Science program, specifically for first-generation students doing fieldwork. The rest would stay in the trust and accumulate until I determined something else worth funding, something practical, something lasting, something my grandmother would have walked past and quietly paid attention to. No distributions to family. Sylvia confirmed what I already suspected. My grandmother had anticipated exactly this moment and had structured things accordingly. There were no legal grounds for a challenge. The trust was solid. My grandmother had been meticulous, the way someone is when they've thought about something for a long time before doing it. My brother's business did not collapse. He and his wife restructured, made some hard calls, leaned on the family they'd married into. It was difficult for a few months. He didn't ask me again about the trust, which I respected. My mother and I started having coffee together on the first Saturday of each month. Not every conversation is easy. Some of them are still navigated around the edges of things neither of us is fully ready to say. But she has started asking about my work with the same specificity my grandmother used to. She keeps an article I wrote pinned to the corkboard in her kitchen. I noticed it the second time I came over and didn't say anything, but I noticed. My father told me once, on the phone, late at night when people say things they've been sitting with for a while, I should have said something at the wedding. I didn't because it was easier not to. That's not something I'm proud of. He didn't ask for forgiveness, he just said it. I think he meant for it to count as something even if he didn't know what to call it. I told him it did. That spring, I was standing in water up to my knees in a section of marsh we'd been restoring for 2 years. And for the first time I could see clear evidence of native cordgrass coming back where there had been nothing but invasive monoculture the year before. It's not a dramatic thing to look at. Most people would walk past it without registering that anything had changed. But I knew what it had looked like before, and I knew what it had taken to get here, and I stood there in the mud for a while just looking at it. Recovery is not a moment. It's a long accumulation of small conditions that eventually allow something to return that was always supposed to be there. I think about that when I think about my family. We are not repaired. I don't think that's the right word for what we are. We're more like that section of marsh, slowly, cautiously, becoming something more honest than what we were before. There are still patches of damage. There are still things that will take longer than I want them to. But the conditions are better than they've been, and I tend to believe that matters. My grandmother named a line in her letter that I keep on a note card above my desk. You have always been worth more than the room was willing to admit. On the hard days, I read it once. Then I go back to work. If you were in my position standing outside that conference room with a sealed letter in your hand and your whole family on the other side of the door, what would you have done? Would you have walked back in? Tell me in the comments. Because from where I'm standing, the hardest part was never the decision itself. It was accepting that I was allowed to make it.